Welcome to Storytime, Holy Men or Power Brokers. How Babylon's priests ruled through fear. In ancient Babylon, religion wasn't just a belief system, it was a tool of control. Priests didn't just serve the gods, they controlled kings, manipulated the masses, and turned divine will into law. But before we begin, let's pause while you get comfortable. Fluff your pillow, pull those blankets up tight, and settle into your favorite spot. Your eyes flicker open to darkness, just the faintest glow of dawn peeking in, questioning. Were they spiritual leaders, or the empire's most dangerous politicians in robes? Religion and politics have always been intertwined, but in Babylon they were inseparable. The priests of Marduk and other gods didn't just preside over rituals, they influenced royal decisions, controlled resources, and shaped public behavior. In a world where the gods were said to rule from above, Babylon's priests ensured that they ruled below. The question is, were they keepers of the faith or architects of fear-based control? Babylon's priesthood was vast, hierarchically organized, and politically powerful. Known as Shangu, Ashipu, or Kalu, depending on their role, these men conducted elaborate rituals, managed temple economies, and interpreted signs from the gods. But these signs often served political ends. The priests decided when omens were favorable, when sacrifices must be made, and when war should or should not be waged. Their power wasn't in swords, it was in divine interpretation. Unlike Babylon, where priests were aligned with royal power, ancient Israel had prophets who often challenged kings. Figures like Jeremiah or Amos openly criticized injustice, even risking death to speak truth. Babylon's priests, by contrast, enforced royal decrees and legitimized rulers through religious ritual. There were no checks, no prophetic rebellion, only compliance. This raises a troubling thought. In Babylon, was divine will truly divine, or was it scripted by the powerful? Babylonian religion was deeply tied to fear. Missteps in ritual could bring disaster. Eclipses and storms weren't natural, they were warnings. And who interpreted these warnings? The priests. They held the knowledge, and thus the people in their grip. Faith became obedience. Questioning the priests risked both political punishment and divine wrath. It was a system designed not for enlightenment, but for submission. Temples weren't just places of worship, they were banks, storehouses, and employers. Priests managed land, labor, and trade. They collected offerings, taxes, and tribute. This wealth further entrenched their power. While common people offered grain and animals, priests accumulated silver, influence, and control. The line between sacred service and financial exploitation grew thin. In Babylon, the priesthood blurred the line between spiritual leadership and political dominance. Their control over divine knowledge, social order, and economic resources made them more than religious figures. They were the shadow rulers of empire. Whether feared or revered, Babylon's priests left a legacy that forces us to ask, when faith and power merge, who truly speaks for the gods, and who profits from their silence? Religious authority in Babylon: priests, prophets, and power. You walk through the blue-glazed lions of a gate that is both museum and memory, and tell yourself you are here to learn how sacred power works. You expect incense and thunder, omens and oracles. What you find first is paperwork, everywhere. Clay tablets stacked like bricks, grain allotments, labor rosters, temple inventories, contracts stamped with seals. In Babylon, you discover holiness is audited. You follow a scribe who wet clays a tablet with the calm of a banker, and you learn that here the gods own fields, canals, workshops, and herds. Priests and temple managers record every shekel of silver and every measure of barley that moves in or out. Sacred power feels heavy in your hands, literally, like clay that remembers every touch. You cross the processional way and step into a precinct where Marduk lives by representation, his statue treated as a breathing presence after its mouth-opening rites. You are told there are specialists for everything: lamentation chanters who sing the gods awake, exorcists who break spells, astronomer scholars who track the paths of planets, and the moods of heaven across a sky that doubles as a legal code. You meet the Baru diviner, who has learned to read a sheep's liver the way others read a letter. You meet the Tupshar Enuma Anu Enlil, the scholar who knows the Omen series so well he can tell a king whether a lunar eclipse means war will come from the west or crops will fail in the east. You begin to understand that in Babylon, sacred power is a system held by institutions, stabilized by routine, reproducible because it is taught. You learn the calendar by the way bodies move. In spring, the Akitu festival lifts Marduk from his temple to parade the city's power in full view. You are there when the king enters, robes arranged like order itself, and submits to ritual humiliation so the god's favor can reset the realm. The high priest takes the scepter, strips away the royal insignia, and slaps the monarch hard enough to bring tears. You're told this is auspicious. The king's tears must run honestly for the city to prosper. In this world, the priest is a hinge and the king swings on it. The ceremony does not merely symbolize political theology, it performs it, rebolting heaven to earth so that canals will carry water and taxes will carry grain. Then you step out of the gate and into another story in which you are told that sacred power speaks with a voice you can hear in the marketplace at noon. You climb the hills of a small city and watch smoke rise straight from an altar above a narrow valley. Jerusalem's temple stands there, and you note that priests also keep rotations and ledgers. They too own flocks and tools. They too know how blood substitutes for guilt. But as you listen for the music of ritual, another sound cuts through, a farmer from Tekoa, untrained in court etiquette, telling a nation that its worship is worthless if the poor are sold for sandals. "Let justice roll," he says, and you realize you have met someone who carries sacred power without a title. You encounter more of them, some rough, some refined, some speaking poetry that could level a forest, others muttering grief into a broken cistern. Nathan stands in a royal chamber and tells a king a parable about a lamb so that judgment can slip past defenses. Elijah strides into Ahab's court like a storm and walks out with a death sentence hanging from his shoulders. Isaiah knows palaces well enough to speak in their grammar, but keeps bending it back toward holiness. Jeremiah writes scrolls that burn twice, first in a fire set by a king who cannot abide them, and later in a city that will not survive. You realize that in Israel, sacred power is not only an office you can inherit or a craft you can learn, it is also a summons you cannot refuse. You turn back to Babylon with new eyes. You ask what happens here when a ruler goes too far. The answer you receive is precise and cool. The scholars advise delays when the heavens turn ill. The exorcists quiet portents with counter-rites. The priests withhold rituals that anchor victory until omens improve. The critique is procedural. It comes in the grammar of if X, then Y. A lunar eclipse becomes a policy memo. A prodigy born with two heads becomes a paragraph in a manual. A comet becomes a schedule adjustment. Even prophecy exists here, but mostly as a letter in an archive, an ecstatic's voice, captured, filed, and balanced against other signs. The temple's job is to keep the machine aligned. If the king must be warned, he is warned in the language of maintenance. Back in Jerusalem, you watch a book discovered in a temple storeroom ignite reforms like dry straw. You witness a young king tear his clothes and change the nation's calendar and smash cultic furniture his fathers tolerated. You understand now how religious speech can topple arrangements that seemed permanent. You learn the difference between living inside a system and standing in front of it. Priests in Jerusalem protect a sacred center, but prophets keep dragging that center into conversations about land seizures, rigged scales, and widows whose cases do not reach the gate. You discover that in Israel the line between heaven and earth intersects the legal code and the poor man's cloak, and the way a judge looks at a bribe. You realize you are being told that God is not a power to be managed, but a presence that will not be domesticated. You return to Babylon with an exile's caravan after what the royal annals will call an unavoidable consequence of geopolitics and the prophets will call a verdict. On the riverbank, you listen to musicians set their lyres in willow branches because they cannot sing the old songs as if nothing has changed. You handle a ration tablet that lists foreign captives receiving oil and barley, and you blink at a familiar name chiseled into routine, a Judean king, deposed, still accounted for, in meticulous Babylonian handwriting. The clay does not gloat, it records. Babylon's temples keep working, incense still climbs the stairways, the god's statue still travels in festival season. Sacred power here does what it has always done, keep the city's relationship to heaven predictable. Among the exiles you meet Ezekiel, who has priestly hands and a prophet's mouth. He maps God's throne on wheels and tells you the presence you thought could be locked to a mountain can move across empires. He will later describe a future temple with measurements so exact they threaten to become a floor plan, and you see the union of priestly detail with prophetic fire in a single voice. Exile becomes a furnace that hardens ideas, one God above all the squares of the sky, one covenant that judges kings and commoners, one hope that cuts through imperial geology like a canal through clay. In letters copied in tight script, you read that the failure of a city does not mean the failure of its God. It means the God refuses to bless injustice. Now you move back and forth, letting the two frames of sacred power overlay each other like night sky and city lights. When you stand inside Babylon's precincts, you agree that ritual can stabilize reality. Fields need irrigation, calendars need fixing, portents need interpretation. Armies should not march when the moon is wrong. You respect the precision, the career-long training, the way divine knowledge builds libraries and libraries build civilizations. You can feel how a city survives centuries when priests build a spine of rights and reading that every new ruler must grasp to sit upright. When you stand inside Israel's prophetic tradition, you see the spine bend into a question mark. You see a farmer, a shepherd, a courtier, a priest in exile become the conscience that keeps covenant from ossifying into a ledger. You learn that thus, says the Lord, can be addressed to throne rooms and marketplaces with the same force. You notice how prophetic speech changes what counts as sacred, not only altar and sacrifice, but also labor contracts and fields returned at Jubilee, the refugee at your gate, and the weights in your bag. You begin to suspect that in this story, holiness prefers verbs to nouns. You look again at political authority, because that is where sacred power keeps showing itself. In Babylon, the king is the apex of a triangle whose base is temple economy and scribal science. He builds, dedicates, repairs, he offers and receives. His victories are etched alongside his piety like twins. The priests mediate this arrangement. They do not usually rupture it. If the sky speaks discomfort, they cushion it in ritual language so the throne can absorb the blow. They know that order is fragile and that their work is the art of maintenance. In Israel, the king is theoretically under covenant the way a ship is under a sky you cannot bribe. Priests surround him with rites that purify and mark time, but prophets reserve the right to call him to court under heaven's law. When the king listens, reform takes. When he does not, exile arrives. Prophetic speech has consequences because it refuses to be procedural. It names, it indicts, it imagines, it promises. It is not a memo, it is an earthquake with grammar. You test these differences against archaeology because you want to be sure you are not only reading poetry. Cuneiform tablets tell you temples owned land and labor and could lend grain at interest. Boundary stones carved with God's emblems guarded property by curse. Royal inscriptions show the king building and rebuilding sanctuaries to anchor his reign. On the other side, ostraca from border towns record letters written as armies close in. Annals from empires list kings of Judah receiving tribute. A cylinder from a conqueror announces a policy of return that allows exiles to go home and rebuild. Scripture's grief and hope sit inside these inscriptions like a soul inside a body. The stones do not preach, they confirm. You press further and ask how each world thinks about truth. In Babylon, truth is what aligns with the pattern. If a sign appears, it has appeared before or close enough. The scholars hunt the precedent. A king pays attention to the archive and measures his steps. The gods favor the one who keeps the liturgy, respects the locks, and reads the sky with humility. The priesthood is the steward of this memory. Its power is the power of continuity. In Israel, truth is what aligns with a person. The covenant is not an equation you solve, but a relationship you betray or honor. You can check a prophet's speech against previous revelation, but you also test it by its fruit, by whether justice rises and the vulnerable are secured and idolatry loses its shine. The priesthood here guards a center too, and in time it will codify rituals with a care rivaling Babylon's, but prophets keep cracking the shell so the kernel does not die of perfection. Sacred power refuses to be only an inheritance. It keeps arriving like weather. You ask what happens to nations when sacred voices speak. In Babylon, they keep the machine running so long the very bricks memorize the ritual. When a dynasty fails, the temple remains. When a foreign king seizes the throne, he learns the right prayers. When the river silts up, the scribes adjust the calendar and the exorcists clear the air. Continuity is a political technology, and the priesthood is its engineer. In Israel, sacred voice is a risk. It might rescue a nation from idolatry under a reforming king. It might be ignored until the walls are breached. Its promise is renewal, and its threat is truth. You watch a city fall not because the priests miscounted incense, but because the people would not stop oppressing the poor. You watch a remnant return because a conqueror's policy coincides with a promise older than the empire. You witness the strange math by which a scorched ruin becomes a school, and a shattered monarchy becomes a hope for a different kind of king. The prophets do not maintain, they midwife. By now you can feel the contrasts under your skin. In Babylon you are invited to join a guild and learn the world until the world sits still under your stylus. In Israel you are seized by a word that outruns your training and stand before powers that can end you. In Babylon the priest gives the king the calendar by which he will rule. In Israel the prophet gives the king a mirror he does not want. In Babylon, sacred power is institutional, cumulative, deeply political by design because it is a partner in governance. In Israel, sacred power is confrontational, sometimes lonely, and political because it refuses to let politics define the good. But you are careful not to flatten the stories. You have seen priestly tenderness in Israel, the slow work of keeping fire on an altar and memory in a people. You have seen prophetic letters filed in Mesopotamian archives, strange voices that bucked the curve of precedent even there. You have seen that institutions can learn courage and that charisms can decay into noise. You have watched Ezekiel, a priest-prophet, measure a temple with a poet's eyes. You let the categories breathe. At the end, you walk again between lions, this time certain that sacred power changes nations not only by thrones and spears, but by words that teach people what a nation is for. If you live inside Babylon's logic, you will prize order, because order feeds children and keeps ships on canals and harvests on time. If you live inside Israel's prophetic cadence, you will prize justice, because justice tells you whose children are not fed and why the canal was dug through their field. One voice says the world holds together when rituals are kept. The other says rituals only hold if the poor can sleep. You are told you must choose, but you suspect you must learn both. You need priests to keep calendars and prophets to keep consciences. You need institutions that do not break every 14 months and voices that do not go silent for fear of losing their seat. You understand why Babylon lasted and why Israel survived. The former built structures that can house human life for centuries. The latter built a criticism that can renew human life whenever structures forget their purpose. You step out into the present with both lessons in your pocket. If you ever hold authority, you promise to love order without worshipping it. If you ever hear a lonely voice saying what you do not want to hear, you promise to test it with patience rather than burn it in haste. On your way out, you pass a final inscription, chipped and stubborn, and it occurs to you that the fate of nations is rarely decided in a single battle. It is decided in the slow pull between temples that maintain and prophets who interrupt, between books that inventory and books that indict, between kings who ask which omens favor their campaign and kings who ask whether their people can find bread. You realize you have been addressed in the second person this whole time because you are not just reading histories, you are being placed inside their choices. Sacred power is not a museum piece you admire behind glass. It is a grammar you will speak whether you mean to or not. And now that you know the difference between a liturgy that blesses injustice and a voice that overturns tables, you are responsible for choosing how your city will pray, which tears must be seen, and whose words will be allowed to shape the year. As the shadows lengthen and the stars begin to whisper, we close the pages of this ancient tale. In the hush of night, truth rests where faith once stood strong. Sleep gently now, wrapped in the echoes of empires long gone. Until next time, when darkness falls and another lullaby of a fallen world begins.